and over to you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hope this works okay. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes, we can. It's not on presentation mode, but we can see it.
Perfect. Okay. Is that looking okay for everybody?
That's it.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Kevin. So we're really pleased to be here today. It's great to be able to give an update about ActEarly, and we're really looking forward to hearing about all the other consortia and networks as well. It's a bit of a double act this morning. I'm joined by my colleague from Bradford, Shahid Islam, who's a senior research fellow with ActEarly. So I'm going to just start with a really quick reminder about what ActEarly is all about. I'm then going to talk through some examples of our research outputs so far. And then Shahid's going to just talk briefly about co-production, which is sometimes overlooked in our enthusiasm to hear about research outputs. And it's also often quite hard to measure it and quantify. But for us, it's really, really key to developing research and delivering interventions that will have the best chance of success. So just a quick reminder of what ActEarly is about. Our vision is to promote a healthier, fairer future for children living in deprived areas through a focus on improving environments that influence health and life chances. And to achieve that vision, we're creating city collaboratories that take a system-wide approach and bring everyone in the system together to develop, test and evaluate upstream interventions. So we're doing that in two areas. The first is Bradford, which is a diverse post-industrial city in the north of England, recently announced as the City of Culture, the next City of Culture, which we're all very excited about. And our other area is Tower Hamlets in London, with similar diversity and disadvantage, but that also hosts some of the highest paid workers in the UK within Canary Wharf, which you can just see in the background in one of those pictures. And what's interesting is that on paper, these two areas look quite similar in terms of their diversity and disadvantage. But as you can see here in the two local authority profiles, often the health outcomes look a bit different. And that's one of the things we're really interested in ActEarly, the north-south comparison of health and wellbeing outcomes. So this is a short presentation, and I've just selected some examples really that reflect what we've been doing so far. And it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through these. A key area for us at the outset was to support natural experiment evaluations. So things that our local authorities were doing anyway, so that we could help identify what works and support the best use of what we all know is a really limited local government resource. So these have included evaluation of Bradford's new clean air zone, which is introduced next week, a qualitative process evaluation of Tower Hamlets' new health impact assessment policy, and a healthy school meals project, which is being developed in Tower Hamlets, and we plan to extend to Bradford. Our interventions, which are generally researcher-led, have included co-locating welfare advice in primary care, the Glasses in Classes randomised control trial, which in Bradford primary schools looked at providing free glasses to children, and that's shown a really positive impact on reading ability. And more recently, a feasibility study of classroom clean air technology, and we have some early results already from that, which suggest a reduction in illness rates and school absence. We've also been developing a simulation model using core wider determinant outcomes to simulate longer term impacts of some of our ActEarly interventions. And then from the outset, we've been really, really keen to evaluate the process of ActEarly, how the consortium works and develops. And we're doing that through two projects, the Research on Research, which is evaluating our impact on collaborations and networks, and through our meta-evaluation, which is looking at our impact on key outcomes. And as part of that, we've developed and published a core outcome set. We've also been supporting policymakers, which we feel is really key to our development as a consortium and making a difference. And we've already started to see a number of policy changes from our work. We've provided academic input to the development of Bradford's food strategy. Through geomapping, we helped identify walk-in testing sites in Tower Hamlets through the pandemic. Our academics sit on a range of local authority groups and boards, and Bradford's Clean Air Zone evaluation is a case study in this year's CMO report. And we've also started to see changes to policy. So we've supported change around school starting age for summer and premature born children. The Glasses in Classes programme that I just mentioned earlier has now been extended by the Department for Education to a further 4 local authority areas. And our Digital Makers programme, which is all about upskilling, digitally upskilling our next generation, has facilitated co-design of curricular content with a range of stakeholders. So we feel that we are really starting to make a difference. One of the things we've been really keen to do is support capacity building in local government so that councils can start to choose and use and generate research themselves. And we've been doing that through helping to support development of data infrastructure and through acquiring external funding where we've involved local authority colleagues and supporting career development for our research fellows. Our knowledge sharing so far has included 52 publications. They're all on our website. We've had 4 successful workshops. Our next is the 6th of October, train strikes permitting. Co-production, Shahid will talk about in just a few moments. And we've also really tried to develop mainstream and social media interaction. Our future plans include re-engaging our partners. At the outset, we had a range of external partners, a few of them are listed there. That engagement stalled slightly through COVID, but we're picking that up again now, and it will be a key focus for our conference next year. We're very keen to share knowledge with other local authorities. So in Bradford, that will be with our combined authority partners, and in London with other London boroughs and the GLA. And really findings are only going to make a difference and get into that policy-making cycle and be acceptable to communities if we involve stakeholders, help them deliver, drive and understand research, and if communities have co-produced it so that interventions have a really good chance of being supported and well received. That feels like a good time to pass to Shahid, who's now just going to talk for a few minutes about ActEarly's communities and co-production approach.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning, everyone. I think it's going to be a bit of a job to sort of condense everything within 5 minutes, but we can give it a good old try. So we set off by thinking about how can we get communities interested and energized by all the work that we're doing in ActEarly, and by that I mean how can they be really involved and help us co-produce it. So often what I've found in various other roles and by various other researchers is we end up going into this negative mode of thinking, what's missing? What can we do to fill these gaps? And instead we turned that on its head and thought about how about we actually go and appreciate what is currently good that's working in communities and build on that instead. So we use the appreciative inquiry model, which is really an asset-based community model to look at what is already working and how we can build on that. Jane, if I can ask you to move to the next slide, please, if that's okay. And the specific model that we used from the appreciative inquiry is the 5D model. And we started off by defining what do we mean by co-production, which itself is a bit of a minefield because people mean different things when they talk about co-production, and we ended up with lots of different ideas about what it is. Some people described involvement as co-production, some people described participation, some people described engagement, but co-production is very specifically something different, and we'll get onto that. But after we defined it, we then went and spoke to 96 people. So this was in a combination of workshops, focus groups, and some one-to-one interviews to look at what is working in our communities. And we went across Tower Hamlets and Bradford and spoke to the voluntary sector, the faith sector, a number of unconstituted charities as well. And we spoke to people about what is it that you do that really works well, that would fall under the banner of co-production. And then we pulled all of that together and turned it into a workshop where we pulled together commissioners, managers, people who are leaders in the field to think about, okay, these are all the things that people say works really well. How can we pull this together in a way and design it? So this was the dream workshop combined with the design workshop. How can we make this work for all our Tower Hamlets in Bradford and everybody in the city for the purposes of ActEarly? And now we're at the stage of delivery, which is, Jane, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, please. We came up with 3 specific pillars which make up co-production, or values as we describe them. But if you're going to have co-production, it must hold these 3 pillars. One of them is equality. So not only just looking for people who you want to get involved in the process of co-production, but people who may ordinarily not get involved, but really need to have a voice in the system and are going to be affected by whatever you're doing, to make sure equality is there. And then also agency. So it's a case of people not just nodding to your ideas as managers and leaders, but they come in because communities may have very different ideas to the ideas that we have as researchers and commissioners and managers, and it's about respecting that difference, and it's allowing them to have that agency. And then the third thing is reciprocity. There's got to be something in this process for communities, and not just for us to sort of build our grants or get publications or design new ideas. There's got to be something for communities immediately that they can see is going to be beneficial to them in the short and the long term. So that's what we worked out through these nearly 100 conversations with different people in different guises. We worked out that's what really makes co-production different and distinctive from other methods and other systems. But to operationalize it, Jane, one more slide, I think it is.
And Shahid, 1 more minute. Yeah,
all
thank
right,
you.
Okay. I'll just end there then. It's basically a case of, to operationalize those values, these are the practical principles that we need to put in place. And if you put these in place, it makes co-production something that you can say, this is really co-production. Now, if you want to read more about our journey and what we found and why it's important, then the next slide has a link to that strategy, which is the culmination of all those efforts, and you can just read more about it there. If I had more time, I would speak a lot more, believe me, but I'll just leave it there.
Shahid and Jane, thank you so much for getting us off to a great start. And again, what I'm hoping we'll see as the consortia present are this very deep connection between researchers and policymakers, really solving today's problems, but looking at innovation in how we engage communities and partners in this. So you've really got us off to a fantastic start. Thank you both so much. We're going to move to the next presenter then, which is Petra Meier. And Petra is from the SIPHER consortia. So Petra, over to you.
Now, what can you see? Can you see?
We can see your slides. It's not yet on presentation mode.
Has it come up? Or
it is now. Yeah, great. Over
Thanks,
to you.
Kevin. This is always scary, talking after ActEarly, which is such a big and long-standing collaboration. I'll do my best. So SIPHER is all about trying to take a systems approach to health and well-being, and to really think about how we work together to tackle health inequalities and improve the health of the public through systems approaches. I thought I'd start with reminding us of our particular impact vision, which is modeled on the UKPRP impact vision that we were given right at the very start when we applied for the consortia. How we thought about it is that within the 5-year investment, we wanted to get to a stage where we have developed new methods and tools which are enriching use by our policy partners, and that we have new evidence which informs policy prioritization and design and also evaluation, that we are starting to see new partnerships in academia and policy, and that we can maybe spot some early effects on the causes of health from our work. And then we thought about, well, if we want to have longer term impact beyond the 5 years, then of course our methods would need to be ready to be rolled out. Our tools would be able to be used for budget decisions beyond just our partner organizations, and that we have evidence that drives policy action, again, beyond our partners, and that we have a good way of monitoring what's happening in the systems that we are concerned with to reduce costs and human suffering from failed policies. And all on that, so to decrease the disease burden and health inequalities whilst thinking about productivity and inclusive growth, which were the two priorities given to us, and which SIPHER is very, very close to through our topic focus areas. So the first thing that I think we've developed over the few years is to come up with a conceptualization of what does a decision support framework for public policy, and especially public policy affecting public health, need to look like. And we've come up with this with a schematic where we start from policy partner goals, and whether that is reducing healthy life expectancy gaps or moving to a well-being economy or net zero or any of the other big challenges, in a way doesn't matter. We're trying to create a framework that is available to support decisions in any of these big picture areas. And we need policy partners who are committed to that kind of idea of adaptive policy design, where you have ideas and drafts and adaptation and implementation and monitoring in a continuous circle, which we have found our policy partners are very keen to move to if they're not already doing it anyway. And then there is this interplay, that merry dance between the policy side and the decision support side, the research side. So we provide evidence on changes in the system, either in response to policy or external influences, such as the cost of living crisis at the moment, very much at the forefront of our thinking. And from the policy partners, we get the information about the changes in the policy landscape, the prioritization, so we can move along with it rather than sort of a few steps behind. And we're not asking, will it work or has it worked in the traditional appraisal and evaluation thing, but how may events or interventions have contributed to changes in the system, and what does that mean for a suitable next move? So a very different way of asking the questions about what do we need to do. And we see, this is a multi-method framework that we're trying to develop. So from qualitative understanding of the system right through to data science, computational modeling, and economic evaluation. And what we're trying to do is iterate through that to try and work out how do these different methods fit together into a truly extended multi-mixed methods design. So where are we at? Decision support products that are already available or coming up. We have developed a lot of policy systems insight into the inclusive economy system as a chameleonic and hard to metricize concept. Understand a lot more about key drivers and levers through systems maps and causal loop diagrams and interviews or workshops. We have produced evidence gap maps, trying to get our head around this massive literature on things like work and health, income and health, now housing and health as major priority areas for us. And that is available on our website. We have quantified indicators for multi-domain well-being, inclusive economy, and increasing health outcomes and how they all relate together. We've created a synthetic population that can be interrogated for the whole of GB and at local authority, LSOA, and data zone level, with all the SIPHER indicators in there and basically built on understanding society and the census. So we're creating basically the products that we can use then to interrogate what do we need to do for different policy scenarios, and whether they are on the income side or housing side or work side. We're creating microsimulation and macro simulation models and decision tools that we can use to inform policymakers in dashboards, in simulations of policy options. So why is that important? Say you've got a question like, until a couple of months ago, we thought the main question we're answering is something around what happens if you move more people to the real living wage? Key policy question that we can answer through our work on work and income, and we can start to provide some insights into what might a real living wage do to mental health and physical health outcomes in the model. But now, of course, we suddenly have a cost of living crisis, or maybe not so suddenly, but policy interest is ramping up, and questions are around what happens if you've got extra child benefit payments in Scotland, but not in England, or questions around, well, what can we, where are priority needs areas? So we've created evidence tools that together allow us to be quite versatile and shift between those different policy priorities and be able to say quite quickly, oh, okay, so if you're interested in people who will struggle with housing affordability, this is where they are, and these are the kind of populations, and these are some of the interventions that might be suitable. And that's sort of where we're trying to move to. And I think we're, some way off of being completely there, but we're starting to apply these things in real life and have been working quite closely with our policy partners. So it's all about the integration of the evidence from all the different work strands. We don't have things that sort of sit alone very well. Some things do, our policy understandings lead to papers, and so does some of our data work. But the key really is to try and get these things together in a way that we can give more comprehensive answers about what's really going on. So just sort of a screenshot of how we think about some of the decision support. At the moment, there is a big tension between driving down well-being inequality, but driving up average well-being. And as a decision problem, that is, where should you focus, and are there solutions that are maybe good at both things? And we can visualize different solution spaces and say, well, look at these kind of options because they seem to be quite good at doing both. And then it's a policy decision, basically, where exactly your priority is. But we can discard a lot of options that just don't do very well on either of the two, or that only tackle one of the outcomes that you may want to tackle. So what does that mean in practice in terms of policy partner implementation? In Scottish Government in particular, we're now reaching into many different portfolios. We've moved away from just mainly talking to our health partners into people who are responsible for the wellbeing economy monitor, people who are interested in green skills, circular economy, biodiversity, and thinking about what does the new workplaces need to look like, and so on. We're talking to the mental health folk and the child poverty team. So lots of different teams who are certainly very interested in where we feel we can contribute to conversations across portfolios, which is what SIPHER always wanted to do. We're sitting on expert advisory groups for the National Outcomes Framework review, the National Performance Framework. We've provided written and oral evidence, and we're providing analysis support related to the cost of living crisis response.
Petra, 1 minute left, Petra.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's fine. And similarly, in Greater Manchester, been involved in an evidence review underpinning the local economic strategy, and similar in Sheffield. So SIPHER is very much starting to feel like it's getting in there with the policymakers where it can really make a difference. And in terms of academic outputs, there's some peer-reviewed publications, 28 of them, a number of follow-on grants, including NERC, a £10 million grant to support Glasgow's just transition to net zero, various consultation responses. And if you want to know more, a lot of our things are open access and live on our website or on GitHub. So if you want access to any of the evidence products and where we're up to at the moment, just let us know and I can point you in the right direction. So thanks very much. This is our partners, and thanks to the generous funding.
Fantastic, Petra. Thank you so much. Again, really helping us to begin thinking through the complexities of policy making, decision making. But in a sense, what I'm hearing you say is, how do you unpack the inputs that go into this, and how do you ensure that for policymakers, they're able to have as broad a perspective on the direct and indirect impacts of their policies, and to be much more robust in terms of the process of policymaking as well. So I have a number of questions for you, as I'm sure colleagues will have. Given the time that we're in now, with a new administration and new policies being floated, how we might look at SIPHER as an opportunity for us to bring more rigor to thinking about some of the consequences of policy making as well. So really exciting presentation as well. Thank you so much, Petra. We'll move on now to hear from Professor Linda Bauld from the Spectrum Consortium. Linda, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm delighted to be here and nice to see so many people. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's put it on the slideshow. Can you see that okay?
Yes, waiting for it to come on slideshow.
I think it should be on slideshow now. Yeah, great. Okay, so some highlights from Spectrum. And many of you will be aware that the work of Spectrum builds on our two previous consortia. And what we're aiming to do is to look at the commercial determinants of health, which I think is a phrase that everyone's familiar with now, and also apply systems science. So I would say, and I think Kevin and introductory remarks from colleagues really summarize this, the world in which we sought the funding from UKPRP is different to the one that we're living in now, as we were hearing at the beginning. And there are other major pressures. We have war in Europe. Petra has outlined the rising cost of living and increasing inequalities. And I guess a question I continually ponder is, our work still relevant, and have we adapted? And how can we stay true to our original aims but be flexible and responsive? Now, like all of you, our teams have been involved in the COVID response as advisors, repurposing existing studies and conducting new ones. But we've really learned, I think, particularly this year, from our alliance partners, including, importantly here in Scotland, the Poverty Alliance. And I think I would argue that our focus on commercial determinants of health remains highly relevant. We've expanded to gambling and food policy, and along with colleagues also looking at the activities of energy producers. And I think capacity building in public health and prevention is even more important than when we started. So we have 8 work packages, which you probably can't even read on the screen, but they're there and available on our website.
Linda, let me just say that you're not yet on presentation mode. So if you're advancing the slides, we're not seeing it. Just, you may want to.
Yeah, let me see, that's interesting.
Yeah, you're on the non-presentation mode.
Okay, I can see it on slideshow on my screen. I'm on my government laptop, which, as you can appreciate, Kevin, is not the right way. So let me see if I can put it on slideshow and then try and reshare. Actually,
exactly.
Right. Sorry about the technical problems.
That's okay. You don't have to happen.
I also had to join on, because I'm on my government laptop, I had to join Zoom on the web. So I don't know, does the UKPRP team like to share my slides? And that would allow us to see them more clearly. So Alex, if you wouldn't mind doing that just from the beginning. And I think we were on the slide just after the work packages. So if you head to the dark blue one there, examples of outputs. Lovely. Okay, next one after this.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So just our expansion on the commercial determinants of health, doing more work recently on food and nutrition, looking at misinformation, for example, in the meat producing industry, and also the transnational food corporations' involvement in multi-stakeholder initiatives and their role in global food governance. So really looking beyond the UK, and importantly, some work on gambling, which I will highlight. There's also important texts that are being produced, not just peer-reviewed journal articles, but also quite an innovative book from a couple of our colleagues at Work Package Lead, one of our funded fellows, and a colleague in the US, Sandra Galea, who many of you will know. And that really tried to consolidate the commercial determinants of health as a distinct research area, looking across policy topics. And that'll be published next month or the beginning of November by Oxford University Press. Next slide. So just thinking, if you can move the next one, Alex. About specific studies, I'll give you 2 examples. We extended our alcohol and smoking toolkit studies in Work Package 3 to Scotland and Wales, new investment from Spectrum, which allowed us to have a comparative context. And we have a website that's updated monthly, so please do take a look. And we're engaging regularly with our policy colleagues in Welsh Assembly, Scottish Government and OHID on this. Next slide. And a couple of outputs we've provided recently, which I think have been quite important, not just for policy colleagues, but our alliances are looking at public opinion on different policy options for addressing harmful alcohol use in tobacco. This is just an example from the alcohol toolkit. And then if you just click again, Alex, some animation should come up. I think if you press button 3 times, they'll all pop up. And this was our paper that was produced recently looking at profile for tobacco control policies. And this is really important because, as Kevin and others will know, the tobacco control plan for England has been delayed, but we're hoping will be appearing very soon. And this paper, just showing the strong support for more ambitious action from government, got some good media coverage as well. Next slide. And in Work Package 5, I see Professor Jamie Pierce is here with us. We have been doing a number of other pieces of work, but this just highlights, sorry, my slides seem to have jumped around. We have a research innovation fund looking at the directors, what used to be called the directors fund. All the consortia have this, and this is our expansion of the toolkit to gambling behavior. So the same data collection resource I just showed you, and that adds in questions on gambling to the survey. You'll be aware this is a substantial public health issue that's been understudied, and industry activity in this area is harmful to families, young people, and to adults. Next slide. And we also are expanding the toolkit to look at illicit tobacco now. The cost of living crisis, so in my government role, I'm coordinating the cross-government work on cost of living. You can see that if you think about people's tobacco consumption, the 6 million smokers we still have, the incentive to obtain illicit tobacco is greater when people are under cost pressures. So we've again added specific questions on illicit tobacco use to the toolkit. Next slide. And then this is Work Package 5, apologies Jamie, where we colleagues published a really important paper, I think, showing that actually it is not that beneficial to small retailers to continue selling tobacco. And I think we've got opportunities to make the case for restricting retail availability on the back of this evidence and others. And again, if you just press the button, Alex, the paper will pop up on that. Great, next slide. Just a couple more thoughts from me, Kevin, and then I'll conclude. So impact and capacity building is really important for all of us in the networks and consortia. And this slide just highlights some of the examples of evidence that our colleagues have given to parliamentary committees at UK level, Wales and in Scotland, our contributions to consultations and our ongoing engagement. And I would say we've got strong relationships with the teams working on unhealthy commodities across all governments, and importantly also in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, where our colleagues, Niamh Fitzgerald and others, are doing work. And finally, our academy, next slide Alex, this is the last one I think, continues to flourish, where we provide training and knowledge exchange opportunities for our younger or earlier career researchers. I shouldn't say young, some of them are not, and they are really going from strength to strength, and it's just great to see making an important contribution to the field. And I think that's the last slide. Just looking at the year ahead, finally, we're going to continue with our work, our strong engagement with policy and practice, publish findings, and continue to review and adjust our focus where necessary. And I think that is important, that we're flexible. We've got some stakeholder workshops coming up, and we're also planning a new knowledge exchange training opportunity on the commercial determinants in partnership with the Association of Directors of Public Health, which we look forward to, and a couple of other highlights there. So thank you again, final slide Alex, just to the funders, to the funding group, the advisory group, and to everyone who's engaged with us, and importantly, all our researchers and all our alliance and public health agency partners within Spectrum. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much. And again, a complementary perspective on policy development, specifically looking at the commercial determinants of health. I think what your presentation highlights is the importance of agility in the work and how researchers are working and embedding with policymakers, so that there's that real-time engagement to solve society's challenges and problems. I think what you also highlight are what are the opportunities for intervening in emerging public health problems. We may well be moving into a new political climate, not only here in the UK, but in Europe and certainly globally, where deregulation may be the name of the game. So removing long-standing legislative protective frameworks that we may have had, and understanding the impacts of those and the collateral impacts of those will be increasingly important. So I think the agility that you mentioned here may well be for things that we should do, but also beginning to articulate opportunities that may present themselves as we move into a much more deregulatory framework. So something for us to pick up, I'm sure, Linda and colleagues, with the questions as well. So we go to the fourth, thanks Linda, presentation for this morning, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Neil Carhart from the TRUUD consortium. Neil, over to you and welcome this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you for welcoming me and giving me the opportunity to talk about TRUUD. Can you see my slides in presentation mode, okay?
Yes, we can. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So as with everyone else, I think I'll upfront just give the caveat that I'm representing a large amount of work from a diverse range of academic researchers and practitioners who've been partnering with us, and I couldn't possibly do them justice, the nuance of their work in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best and pull out some headlines to share with you today. For those of you who don't know, I'll provide a brief simplified overview of TRUUD to begin with. So it starts from an evidence base that links urban environments to the prevalence of non-communicable diseases, things like air quality, access to green space, the extent to which the design of our cities support or hinder physical activity, sense of security, the quality of buildings and developments, how access to those things are distributed. So TRUUD's aim is to then reduce the incidence of non-communicable diseases by working with communities and decision makers to change the way that urban development decisions are made. So we're aiming for things that make it easier for decision makers to count the costs of poor health linked with urban environments. So there is a piece of work that TRUUD is involved with, being led up from the University of Bath colleagues, on economic valuation, and a tool that will allow those decision makers to better account for those downstream impacts on health when they're making upstream decisions about the urban environment. There is a separate piece of work, or related connected piece of work, I'll say in a minute, looking at the way we better account for the concerns and lived experiences of citizens in those urban development decision making processes. But we recognise that those are, of course, part of a bigger puzzle, and they fit within a system of decision making. So fundamentally, as you can see, the project is all about understanding how those decisions are made and the wider systems of policies, practices, laws, standards, etc., that incentivize, discourage, or compete with the consideration of health. And that equally means understanding things like cultural norms, mental models, behaviors, values. And so there's a whole team of researchers that are working at how those things all fit together. Equally, we have two active case study projects, one with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and one with a housing development at Bristol City Council, and then a meta research evaluation package, which is doing work looking at how we investigate and research and evaluate big complex projects with this. So TRUUD has this big primary engagement team, which has expertise in spatial planning and transport, population health, management sciences, policy, law, real estate, all of those kinds of things, trying to work out how we map the system of decision making to identify potential areas of intervention, and so we can work out how that economic valuation, public involvement fits within that system in a meaningful way. And broadly speaking, I personally find it useful to conceptualize the project in terms of the Design Council's double diamond. It's iterative, it's not linear, but there's phases of divergence and convergence. And really what phase one of the project I'm going to talk mostly about today is doing is trying to map the system of urban development decision making, something that is a complex system that requires engagement with a broad range of stakeholders involved in that system. And through that, we've been able to then narrow and focus down into what are the key problem areas, the challenge areas, the leverage points, define that kind of potential interventions that we can do, and then co-design, co-develop, co-produce interventions in phase 2 and then implement those in phase 3. And the project is sort of in that blue band where we're in the process of co-developing and co-producing those interventions. So in terms of key research outputs from phase 1, that primary engagement work package is spoken to 123 people in semi-structured interviews, or there's been 123 semi-structured interviews rather, with an average length of around 54 minutes. There have been participatory workshops which have spoken to and engaged with a further 47 people, 900,000 words of transcribed interview data that have been analysed, identifying around 22 thematic categories. We've produced causal loop diagrams which contain 430 variables that are involved in this process of urban development decision making that affect the extent to which health is considered in those decision making processes. There is, alongside this, the economic modelling to produce this an economic tool that will allow urban development decision makers to evaluate different policy decisions, to make more informed decisions about health, and tools to aid citizen engagement. And then those themes, those causal loop diagrams, the outputs of those interview data is helping us to ensure that those economic modelling and citizen engagement can be effectively embedded in the system. And one of the key lessons, I suppose, from the interview data is that across the broad spectrum of actors that we spoke to, there is a general agreement as to the root causes of poor health and well-being in urban spaces, but it raises questions as to why those things are not better considered already, which is where the interview data is helping us to unpack some of those things. So that interview data, as some headlines, is revealing some patterns and some themes, different problem spaces, which are a nexus of interacting issues. So here are some groups of some of those headline things that are coming out. For example, issues around policy and regulation and the alignment, particularly up and down hierarchies of control, the influence of local authority, diversity and inclusion in the decision making and representation, agency, those kinds of things that came out in that. Many actors across the system felt that they didn't have ultimate power to intervene to increase the consideration of health, and that really speaks to the complexity of the urban development decision-making system. So we took that interview data, as I said, we produced a series of system maps, causal loop diagrams, if you like, which were looking at the factors from different stakeholder perspectives that were affecting the extent to which health was being considered in their element of decision-making. And then we're looking to combine those into an overarching map. So we have 7 maps from different stakeholder perspectives. They, for example, give us a list of variables and factors that are, as I say, influencing the extent to which health is considered, and then we can use those to try to better design our intervention points. So from all of that data, the interview data, from the workshops, from the systems mapping, around 50 potential intervention areas were identified and grouped into some broad themes. Firstly, around mechanisms and practices, the provision of tools that allow people to make better decisions, mechanisms for land acquisition, professional standards, those kinds of things. And then there were a range of things around private sector policies, shareholder incentives, power, cost, short-termism in terms of visioning, those kinds of things. There were a range of things around public sector policies where interventions could be made around leadership, around responsibility, around local versus national policy making. And then there was a set of potential interventions around data gaps, the provision of data, knowledge gaps, awareness, understanding, skills and resources to include health in decision making, partnerships but across different organisations involved in the decision making processes, and public engagement as a big theme that came out of there for a potential intervention in itself. So those are the intervention areas. So an output of phase 1 will be is the set of academic publications that are coming out of that and summarising it. 12 academic publications already under review or published, and more in line to summarise phase 1 and the information that's come out of there. But the main outcome from phase 1 is the facilitation of phase 2 and phase 3, which is the co-design of interventions. So it's provided us with the clarity and simplicity on the far side of the complexity of urban development decision-making. It's allowed us to develop relationships within the project and with our external partners to co-design these interventions from a position of knowledge of the complexity of that system and all of the factors that are at play. So briefly, in terms of some implementation stories, where we are at the start of phase 2. the project is now formed into these 6 intervention co-design teams. These are developed from that understanding of the intervention points and the findings from phase 1. So there is an intervention based around national public sector policy, one around property and planning, one around UK planning law, one around the norms, powers, mental models. And these all link together with the 2 case studies in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Bristol City Council. So briefly, that one within Manchester, which is looking at the Streets for All project, an ongoing project. It brings together expertise from Manchester in a range of different areas. It brings together external partners, but equally it brings in expertise within that team from across the whole of the TRUUD group into how the those economic decisions are evaluated, the use of that tool, citizen engagement, systems modeling, those kinds of things. And so that intervention team was looking at the co-production of new health KPIs, how they are used within data decision making. So the use of that economic modeling tool to influence new KPIs for the ongoing Streets for All process and how they are used within decision making. It's also, as part of that intervention, looking at how that becomes a continuous learning process. So it's not a one-off for this project, but how we change norms, behaviours, standards, and provide the skills and resources to be able to produce the next wave of KPIs when the world changes, when a different project arises to do that. And then how that transfer of knowledge is broadened out beyond the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Another intervention group is looking at those norms and powers. So again,
1 minute left to Neil, thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. So based within Bath, looking at understanding what it is around normative language and standards and policies and what affects people's behaviour when making these kinds of decisions. Again, that's drawing elements from across the project. So we can embed that economic tool into the private sector with a full understanding of ensuring that that is effective and that works. So changing mindsets and improving local capacities. And that's very closely aligned with the housing development and the case study in Bristol. So briefly, in terms of dissemination plans, I've already talked about publications and academic publications. We have website, blogs, social media, webinars, workshops, all the standard kind of things in place. We also have some practitioner focused and public focused videos, which have just been produced and will be going online shortly, and in process of developing some policy briefings and nice reports to summarize all of the work from phase 1. But really the main thing is co-design and co-production that moves forward. That's at the heart of it. So it's about continually working through phase 2 and through phase 3, as Kevin said, with those people who are actively in those challenge situations. And that is the dissemination of the learning, I think, from phase 1, is through working with those people to develop solutions or to improve the problem situation. So again, as always, to sum up, thank you very much to the funders, our partners, and everyone who's participated in the interview and workshop data gathering. Thank you.
Neil, excellent job. Thank you so much. And again, you know, having worked in local and regional public health, this is one of the big challenges that we have as we shape place and we think about all of the inputs which are required for us to both do this in a way that is much more inclusive, much more community-centered and oriented, and that we understand the range of metrics that are required for us to look at the short, immediate and long-term impacts of our place shaping efforts. So really interesting to see this work bringing it all together. So colleagues, we have 10 minutes now for questions. I hope in the first taste that you've had of the initial 4 consortia funded in phase 1 of UKPRP, you have a sense of both the breadth of areas which are being covered, the innovation that's being used, and of course the delivery of a range of outputs that are already beginning to demonstrate the value add of this work and this approach. So with that, let's go to some questions. I'm going to ask, I think Alex, you're monitoring the chat, or if colleagues would like to raise their hands to ask any questions, we're happy to do that as well. And while we're waiting, I'm probably going to ask Petra. As you know, Petra, I'm always coming to you first, but because I am so actively involved in policy making, maybe just to get started with this. And the question I guess to ask you is, what is the response of policymakers to this more, and maybe this is to all of the presenters this morning, how are policymakers engaging with and adapting to this more transparent, structured, systematic and inclusive way of developing policymaking, developing policies? Is there pushback? Is there resistance? Is this being welcomed with open arms? And the reason I ask this is, as you have said, Petra, policymakers are dealing with a range of inputs at any given stage, including evidence into making decisions. And I wonder if being more transparent and being more structured is being met with any pushback at all, or any challenges with that. So Petra.
I wouldn't want to reify the contribution of evidence into anything really.
Sure.
I think it's been welcomed as another way to think about the systems and another way to engage with others who are grappling with similar problems. So in particular, the sectoral silos and the way in which this kind of evidence can help break that down by, you know, forcing conversations that otherwise may not have happened. So the kind of things that are really hard to evaluate, because what, you know, how can we ever evidence that having had that conversation leads to a difference in policy decision making? But if I had to say what the real impact is, it's in facilitating that ongoing dialogue between academics and policymakers in different parts of an organization, and starting to think differently about the topics. And then you sort of hear health creep into conversations where otherwise it would not have been in there. And similarly, you know, sort of the economic concerns and those kind of things creeping into some of the health conversations in new ways, which I always enjoy a lot. And yes, the quantitative evidence is also cool and interesting and helps to pinpoint where to do interventions, but in a way that's not the real system transformation, as far as I think our policy colleagues would say, and as far as I've sort of experienced it when we go into those conversations.
Okay, great, thank you, Petra. And as we go through the questions for the next 10 minutes, maybe from other consortia, if you'd like to reflect on that as well. I'll take a couple of questions first from Sarah and then Jane. Sarah?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentations. That's really, really interesting. My name's Sarah Excel. I'm a consultant in public health in Bradford Council. So we do quite a lot of work in Bradford Council with planning departments and with, you know, obviously with policymakers. One of the areas of work that I lead on is gambling harms reduction, and we've recently worked quite closely with policymakers and produced a lot of evidence and managed to get a planning application refused for a big gambling company that wanted to open up in the centre of town. One of our concerns now is that the company have indicated that they are likely to challenge that legally, and looking through a lot of previous challenges and appeals, usually the National Planning Inspectorate overturns the council's judgment. So I guess my question is, I feel like our hands are tied a lot in local government by national policy and national, I guess ideology in a way about, you know, I think somebody mentioned reducing the, you know, input and kind of more permissive nature of things. So is there any work going on with national policymakers, and how can we influence national policymakers both as local government and as academics and partnerships? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Linda, I may come to you to respond to Sarah initially. Let's hear from Jane first, and then I'll start with you, Linda. Jane.
Thanks, Kevin. Sorry, I was going back to your comment about policymakers, and it was just a few observations about working in particular with local government, and Sarah is part of that, who's just spoken. For me, that one thing that we've learned and has come across really clearly, and it's a bit like Petra said, you know, evidence is just one thing that's considered, that's on the table for local government. And in particular, there's a different language. So what local authorities call evidence is different to what we might call evidence. You know, elected members might see an email from a constituent as evidence. So there's quite a big change there, and there's learning on both sides for us to start to understand that process better, as well as wanting local authorities to embrace research. And then just really quickly, the other 2 points are the timeliness of research, and often the kind of research we might do just takes too long for them. They don't have that kind of length of time in a cycle of decision making to wait for that. And then they also want it to be, you know, half a page of brief text, nothing like the kind of output that we churn out. So I think that's a big learning curve probably for all of us, to learn to be able to work with a different environment and a different language.
Great, thanks, Jane. And I think I was thinking, welcome to my world as a public health practitioner of distilling the evidence, landing it, but understanding the sort of political imperatives, which may be the manifesto. It may be the sort of paradigm of leadership that you're dealing with, and then having to use and frame that evidence in a way that lands well and lands effectively. But Linda, I'll come to you to start off with Sarah's question on national policymakers and what might be the opportunities there. And again, any of the other presenters can come in as well.
Sarah, thanks for that question. I think it's so important. And I think in so many areas of public health, we've seen local government, including actually in the case of planning, be at the front line of some of these new emerging and tricky issues. So I hope you can hold your stand, and really, I guess a couple of things I would say, starting with other local examples, that I'm sure you've done this, of identifying other councils that have had similar challenges, engaging with the LGA and others on that. And really, if you can find those locations, I'm not as familiar with the English system, working together. And then I think, yes, reaching out to national government, and obviously within OHID, I think the Rosanna O'Connor's team, who have responsibility for gambling related harm, you know, do engage with them. They'd be very keen, I think, to understand the challenges that you're facing, and can reach out to other parts of government. You know, the cross-government working is something that colleagues work very hard to do. So that would be my comment on that. And then if it's useful to follow up offline with some of the researchers that are doing this gambling work, I'd be very happy. Just on the discussion you had with Petra and Jane's comments, I agree with all of that. Somebody who wears two hats. The challenge that I see with my policy colleagues is just the kind of things that Jane highlighted. And I think for me, a starting point is developing long-term relationships. So, you know, you're always going to be the first person they contact if they need advice quickly, if they already know you and they trust you. So those relationships are worth really building up, and supporting our earlier career researchers to be exposed to policy colleagues and having those. And in some cases, I'll give you a totally unrelated policy example of working on the Ukraine displaced people's, the super sponsor scheme we have here in Scotland. When we set up the scheme, we did not have time to consult with any academics. There was no way. And we only did that about a month, 6 weeks in. And of course, their advice has been invaluable. So it's just about recognizing that sometimes it's not possible to do that with new issues. So, but if you're already there, it helps. And then the final point just to make on that is sometimes the things we produce don't get used for years, but then they suddenly appear. Another example, we were looking at non-domestic rates in the context of cost of living, and we had an initiative here in Scotland that was in place in the past, and some researchers had done a valuable paper on it. When I was asked to pull together the evidence, you know, I knew exactly where to go because they'd done it, you know, not widely known about. So stuff we do now, if it doesn't matter today, it might matter in the future, and that's really important. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Linda. So for the final brief question for this session, Tim has put in the chat a question about meaningful, elevated and integrated community voices within data and evidence and decision making, and if there were any practical tips from colleagues. And I think all of you reflected on this, but I wondered, just before we close for a short break, if anybody would like to say your top 5 things in terms of what you're learning now about strengthening the community voice and input into decision making. Would anybody like to come in here on this? Any of the presenters?
I'll have a go, Kevin, if that's okay.
Okay, great, Neil. Thanks.
So we've got to see my colleague Jo, I can see is in the meeting, and she's an expert leading on our citizen engagement package. I think the challenge is really recognizing that there are such a diversity of means to engage in the process. The process itself, as we found in TRUUD with urban development decision making, is complex, and the means with which to communicate with people and the processes through which they feel most comfortable communicating and sharing is very diverse, as people are diverse. And so providing means that allow people to have, as I think Shahid's principles of co-design and co-development are really important. It was great to see those.
Yeah, really good.
I think maybe if there was time, if you had an opportunity to maybe talk about those, but I think as something transferable that allows for that agency and inclusion is really the thing. It's about not just working on that day for that group of people, for that decision, but that it can be transferable and transdisciplinary, both across the spectrum of silos and individuals and groups, but also up and down the silos of power and the hierarchies of power, both from national policy making right down to individual decisions about what happens on a street with a particular development or the siting of a betting shop or whatever it might be. So I think having those principles that are transferable is a really useful intervention. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Neil. And I think your suggestion for Shahid, if it's possible to either post your slide on the principles in the chat so colleagues could have a look at those, that would be great. And Neil, just to say I agree entirely with what you've said, and one of the things we've certainly learned from a practitioner's perspective is the importance of building trust. Right, that one of the things we have learned is the sort of ad hoc, episodic, inconsistent engagement with communities doesn't build trust in the process and doesn't result in confidence that actually the community's voice will in fact matter. So as we're doing everything that you've suggested, Neil, I think there's something about the behaviors, the leadership behaviors that we have as researchers, as implementers, to ensure that we build a deeper relationship over time that can have that impact as well. So colleagues, it's 11:12. We're going to have just a brief break now, as I say, a bio break for us to get up, walk, have some refresh a little bit, and then we'll start again at 11:20. So we'll have 8 minutes, and then we'll come back to hear from the next 3 consortia from phase 2 of UKPRP. Thanks to the initial presentations this morning for getting us started, and we'll restart at 11:20. So thanks everyone, and see you in 8 minutes or so. I'm just going to